China and Russia are now cooperating on a number of fronts. They're united in their mistrust of the West. So, is this partnership helping to prolong Russia's war in Ukraine? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the US has accused China of supplying Russia with components which could be used in the Ukraine war. It has also slapped sanctions on Chinese companies for their actions. As the war drags on and the sanctions bite, will Beijing continue to help Moscow?
This is what the aftermath of a drone attack can look like. Russia has used drones to lethal effect in Ukraine. Some of the components used in these weapons allegedly come from China. In May, the US slapped sanctions on 20 firms in China and Hong Kong for supplying parts to Russia.
We do see evidence that there are Chinese firms that may be aiding in the flow of this equipment and material to Russia.
NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has accused Beijing of supplying machine parts and microelectronic components that could be used in munitions, artillery, tanks and drones, and to track Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield. But China says the components it exports are in line with international laws and regulations.
On the Ukraine issue, the blame game has misled the international community into making irresponsible remarks about China's normal military build-up and its relations with relevant countries.
Western leaders accuse it of selling components that can be used for either military or civilian purposes, so-called dual-use technology. So, what's in it for China? For one, cheap Russian energy. China is Russia's biggest export market for coal and crude oil, and its second biggest for natural gas after the EU. In return, it floods the Russian market with Chinese-made goods, products which Moscow welcomes after years of being sanctioned by the international community. On balance, Beijing has the upper hand over Moscow economically and politically. China's economy is many times bigger than Russia's, even if it is in the doldrums at the moment. And Moscow has been further cut off by the West after it began its war in Ukraine. That's something that Beijing is acutely aware of. As the world's second biggest superpower, it knows its actions could risk it becoming a pariah like North Korea. So, China is playing a careful, long game. Some analysts say the war in Ukraine has provided a welcome break for China. With the West focused on the conflict on its doorstep, its gaze has shifted away from China's growing footprint in its neighborhood, including Taiwan. So can China continue to perform its high-stakes, high-wire act indefinitely?
Well, let's meet our guests. Martin Smith is a senior lecturer in Defence and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He joins us from Surrey in the UK. In Moscow, we have Sergei Markov. He's a former public spokesman for Russian President Vladimir Putin and director of the Institute of Political Studies. And I'm delighted to say here with me in the studio is Andrew Leung. He's an independent analyst on China. Andrew, I'll come to you first. A lot of people say and feel that a war in Europe is simply none of China's business. What would you say to that?
Well, China's forced into, being involved because of, again, China has been closely related with the Russian economy because the two economies have been extremely complementary well before the war. Because China, of course, is the world's largest energy importer, and Russia is one of the world's largest energy exporter, both energy and also agricultural products. So I think the two economies, the two countries, have been economically intertwined for many, many years before the war. And because of the war, and China was implicated because the West, the American-led NATO and the Western coalition is blaming China for trading with Russia. And so I think that China has been forced into the game. But the last thing China wants is a war because it disrupts the world's supply and value chain, affecting not only the trade with China or China with the rest of the world, but also increasing inflation and all sorts of things. So the last thing China wants is a war. So China is trying to broker the peace over Ukraine.
So you feel China is simply standing by its ally, Russia?
Not really, because China doesn't want to not to be seen to be supporting Russia, of course, over the war in Ukraine. As I said, it's not China's war. But China wants to broker peace because it would restore stability in the international trade and also into the international supply and value chain, affecting the livelihood of many, many people around the world.
Let's bring in Sergei Markov in Moscow. Sergei, many observers in Western Europe feel that China supporting Russia, buying Russian oil and gas is prolonging the war in Ukraine.
No, Russia is shooting war in Ukraine by cooperation with Russia because more support of Ukrainian repressive undemocratic Russophobic regime, more long war will take. More Russia strong, the finish of war is more close because the main aggressor in Ukrainian war is United States of America, which occupy politically in style of 21st century Ukraine, imposed neo-colony regime and fighting by Ukrainian hands against Russia. It's first. Second, of course, China is cooperating with Russia, and because it's a very big two economies and they have very big borders, the biggest border between two countries is the border between Russia and China, but also political idea very important. Everybody understands that Russia is fighting not only for own interests, but for interests of China as well, because United States of America want to have hegemony, domination. If Russia theoretically, United States of America theoretically crash Russia, immediately after this they will start some kind of provocation, hybrid war against China. And one Chinese diplomat told something like this, I think very good formula. Americans, first of all, ask to betray our friend and enemy Russia, and then Americans, after crashing Russia, will attack us. What will be our solution? It's clear, to be with Russia.
Thanks, Sergei. Bring in Martin Smith. Martin, what's your view of the Russia-China relationship and China helping to prolong matters in Ukraine? I mean, the war in Ukraine, a lot of people feel, would not have gone on this long if China had not been buying Russian energy.
I think Russia, Mr. Putin's decision to attack Ukraine has put the Chinese government in a very, very difficult position. I think Andrew alluded to this quite diplomatically a few moments ago, because on the one hand, it's been an absolutely fundamental element of Chinese foreign policy going all the way back to the foundation of the People's Republic in 1949, fundamental principle to oppose acts of aggression against the territory or the sovereignty of any state, non-interference in the internal affairs of any other state. And quite clearly, Russia has been grossly interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine since 2014 and particularly since February 2022. On the other hand, as both our other guests have alluded to, Russia is probably China's most significant partner. It's not an ally. There are limitations to the relationship, despite the rhetoric about no limits partnership. But nonetheless, Russia is China's most significant partner in the world today. And so the Chinese government under Xi Jinping has had to try to straddle a difficult divide. So what you've seen on the one hand is, as Andrew alluded to, a talk about peace from the Chinese government. I would hesitate to describe it, on the other hand, as China actively trying to broker peace. It simply made a number of general statements that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states is sacrosanct, that the Ukraine war is somehow the fault of NATO and the United States, even though Russia attacked Ukraine, and that there should be peace. What China has not done, and I think that reflects the difficult position, to be honest, that the Chinese government is in. It's not yet felt it can go beyond that and actively start putting together and proposing an actual peace plan and actively brokering peace. So at the moment, China has not come out firmly against Russia in any practical way, but equally, there are limitations that the Chinese government has imposed on the level of the support that it's actually prepared to give to the Russian military effort in Ukraine.
Andrew, there was a phrase used recently by Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing Secretary General of NATO, about China. He described your country as a decisive enabler of Russia. How do you feel about phraseology like that?
Well, I think this is, again, a kind of twisted rhetoric, if you like. I mean, if you want to demonize China, you can use all sorts of descriptions and terms to term a natural relationship, economic relationship of China and Russia, as I said before, which dates back, decades and many decades ago, because the two economies have been extremely complementary. But I think that as far as China's effort to broker peace is concerned, because as I said, peace is in very much China's interest because it affects the international trade, affects China's economy and the economies of the rest of the world. It's more than just talk, because at the end of the day, China just cannot hand down 10 commandments, from the mountain, and for others to follow. So there's got to be a genuine process of negotiations. And what China is trying to do with the 12-point peace plan, within quotation marks, is that, first of all, you've got to give up the idea of the Cold War idea is either win or lose, because that's the whole point about peace talks. Because if just one side surrenders everything, there is no peace talks. As the same with over North Korea. If you ask North Korea to give up everything before even talks begin, then nothing would happen. So I think that's the first principle. The first principle of giving up this Cold War idea of win and lose. And then secondly, the second principle is also the principle embraced by many countries. It's of course referred to by colleagues earlier on this panel, is respect each other's country's sovereignty. Now, of course, the sovereignty of Ukraine has got to be respected as much as the sovereignty of Russia, but also the security concerns of not only Ukraine, the security concerns of Russia as well, and other countries in the region. So that's the first principle. Then secondly, very importantly, is that the parties wanting to peace need to start talks and not just empty words, just rhetoric, exchanging rhetoric. It's not the beginning of peace talks. So they've got to take concrete action to start the peace talks. And then thirdly is the protection of civilians, so stopping the war from affecting civilian lives, protecting the security of nuclear installations, because that is going to lead to unintended consequences, and the protection of or the safeguard against indiscriminate or even use of nuclear weapons, and also the protection of supply and value chains, particularly sort of goods and agricultural products affecting many countries around the world. And last but not least, and that's got to come, is the reconstruction of a totally destroyed Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Sergei, how important, from a Russian perspective, is the relationship with China?
This is very important relationship, and of course, you may know that China and India are two biggest economy, which bought most of the Russian gas and oil, Russian energy, and give Russian economy money. Also, very important that China is trading by different goods which are used by Russian different economic factors and so on. And thirdly, very important that China's position very influential on in other countries of so-called global south. And Russia that China and a lot of countries after China decided not to take part in those conference in Switzerland, which Americans called Summit of Peace, but it's appeared to be a conference of war. And this position of China very important. As to the peace plan, China has very specific peace plan, which is supported by most of the countries of the global south. It's very simple, so-called Korean scenario. Just ceasefire, stop fighting on the front line, and then to start negotiation. Those negotiations could be continued, as Chinese are talking many years, even decades, but most important, that will be already no war, no killing of people, no destroying of the global economy. But Russia denied this Chinese plan and explained to Chinese friends why Russia denied. Because we are absolutely sure that it will be not peace, it will be a break of the war during maybe half of year, maybe one of the year, which will be used by aggressor, which is NATO, West, and United States for the rearming of the Ukrainian army in starting this war again. We already have experience of the Minsk I agreements, Minsk II agreements. Both of these agreements have been used by United States of America, who occupy Ukraine for the rearming or the arming of the Ukrainian army, making a more strong political repressive regime, and then to start the war again. So no reason to trust to those who is lying every time.
Thank you, Sergei. I want to bring Martin in here. Martin, give us the Western viewpoint on that relationship between Putin and President Xi of China. It troubles a lot of people in the West how close Russia and China are, doesn't it?
It does, and I think the Western concern is summed up in the phrase you alluded to a few moments ago, that China overall has acted as Russia's decisive enabler in Ukraine, not necessarily in terms of the military, the direct military support that has been provided, because going back to the previous point I was making, the Chinese government has been very careful to calibrate the level of practical support. It's not offered, as far as we know, direct military assistance by supplying artillery shells or drones, for example, but it has been supplying so-called dual-use technologies, which Russia can use in order to improve and maintain its own weapon systems. But I think more importantly is the political and diplomatic cover that China has been providing, because going back to your original question as to what has a war in Europe actually got to do with China, well, another dimension of that, of course, is that China is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. And under international law, the UNSC has, and I quote from the UN Charter, primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. And the permanent members within that have a leading responsibility because they are the permanent members with the power of veto. They have a special position and therefore special responsibility. So the fact that China has not been using that and not been exercising that responsibility to restore peace and security in a UN member state which has been attacked by another UN member state, i.e. Ukraine, that it's not gone beyond broad generalizations about stopping the shooting and respecting the sovereignty of other states, which frankly, it's too late for that. What we need is concrete action. And because China is Russia's closest and most significant partner, it's in a unique position to bring pressure to bear, at least behind the scenes, on Mr. Putin to cease and desist and be genuinely willing to, as Sergei's rightly said, come to the negotiating table. But the problem so far is that Russia has not been genuinely willing to come to the negotiating table. The problem is that China has chosen not to exercise and to use the relationship that it has with Russia to bring that sort of pressure to bear. And so in that sense, I think Mr. Stoltenberg is quite right to describe China as having been, so far, Russia's decisive enabler in the Ukraine conflict.
Andrew, there's a lot of concern in the West over dual-use components. The suspicion is that China is shipping in components to Russia, dual use. Some of them are being used in military components and military manufacturing. What would you say to that accusation?
Well, first of all, it's not a military component. Otherwise, the word military would have been used. As for dual use, well, I can use the knife to cut my apple, but I can use the knife to kill you. Is that dual use? So I think that this, of course, is an exaggerating example, but this shows that there is a great deal of rhetoric, behind this kind of accusation. At the end of the day, China cannot stop the war, and the war is being fueled by American money, by American ammunition.
Some say Chinese money.
Well, I mean, as far as the NATO forces are concerned, and as far as the Ukrainian, the fighters are concerned, they are fueled by American money and American supplied ammunition. But the reality remains that the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition in spite of the money. But money doesn't translate immediately into ammunition. And because the Ukrainians are spending, they spend 1 year fighting, they consume about 4 years of military ammunition production. So they're running out of ammunition fast, as well as running out of fighters, even though morale still remains high. But then, because of all these dynamics. And the one thing, there's a major game changer coming up on the horizon, and that's a Trump presidency, a second-term presidency.
So what's your prediction?
This is going to change the game completely.
In whose favor?
Because President Trump, Trump has said many times that it's going to end the war in 1 day. And his newly chosen Vice President Vance also recently repeated that kind of strategy, because they want to concentrate on China. They said that the Ukraine is a faraway place, and then they think that the NATO members, they're not pulling their weight, and then so that's quite clear. Then as soon as President Trump returns to the White House, the war would end very quickly.
Let's get Sergei on this.
No price guessing on whose terms it would end.
Well, let's bring Sergei back in on this. Sergei, Andrew says if Trump wins in America, it's a game changer. Trump has said apparently that he will end the war in 1 day. How does Russia see Trump coming back into power if it happens? You welcome it?
Welcome, but quite moderate. I understand very well that the main goal of Donald Trump is not to stop war in Ukraine, but to beat Biden and to win elections and to become the president, and then to pay attention to the domestic politics, to stop illegal migration, to encourage economic growth and industries and other things like this. And Ukraine is not a priority for Donald Trump.
Thanks, Sergei. I'm going to bring Martin in. Just final point from you, Martin. How do you see a President Trump in 2025 wading into this relationship between Russia and China, and what does that mean for Ukraine?
I think if we know anything at all about Donald Trump, we know that he's unpredictable, and so it's very difficult by definition to make any hard and fast judgments. On the other hand, because he and his advisors and supporters and officials are constantly repeating this mantra about settling the Ukraine conflict in a day. I think Mr. Trump, if he is elected, will feel obligated for political reasons to try to do something. But I think the final point I would make, in answer to your question, what about Ukraine? It's very easy in discussions like this to think in great power terms, to talk about Russia, China, and the United States, and to perhaps assume that Ukraine is a purely passive actor in the equation. I think a factor that really hasn't been taken into adequate account so far is whatever the future president of the United States might wish Ukraine to do, the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people have demonstrated very clearly over the last 2.5 years, number one, that they have their own clear interests at stake in their national survival, as they see it. And number two, they are in every sense prepared to fight for their survival and their existence. So regardless of what Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin might try to cock up from January next year, I think ultimately what happens in Ukraine will be decided on the basis of what the Ukrainian government and people choose to do in terms of continuing the fight. And all the evidence we've seen so far suggests that the Ukrainian government and people are determined, to continue the fight.
Martin, Sergey and Andrew here with me in the studio. That's all we have time for. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.